Tired of flat, boring boards? These risers are the solution and add modular verticality and reshape the battlefield in seconds.
Hey folks, my name is Leif and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel called Devs and Dice, where I paint miniatures or craft awesome terrain for the tabletop. Today I'm going to walk you through the process where I elevated my flat Mordheim board with these modular stackable risers that can change the battlefield in moments. Before we get into it, I want to ask you a small favor. If you like the channel and the content I make, then please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you. Now let's get cracking, shall we?
I have made some risers in the past. From that, I have derived some new learnings of what worked well and what didn't work well. But I have also added some new requirements to my new risers. I wanted to make risers that were large enough to have multiple buildings on them. I wanted the risers to reshape my Mordheim board between battles and make it almost seem like an entirely new spatial situation. Before starting the actual crafting, I spent days and weeks planning the shapes in Adobe Illustrator. I went back and forth between the highly modular approach where each piece could be anything. The problem with this approach is that it feels like a container of Legos. Yeah, I can build anything I want, but it will require a lot of work and it's not very inspiring. My second approach was much more accessible, and it was the one I went with. It was to make the shapes larger and enable them to be stackable and modular in the sense that I could put them together to create new and interesting shapes. No magnets, no clips, no alignment tools, just drop them on the board and go have fun. I also knew that even though I'm all for square and rectangle shapes, it is something that doesn't necessarily play well on the Mordheim board and it looks way too engineered and not proper happy-go-lucky flying by the seat of my pants medieval. As a general rule of thumb, I went with two basic measurements. 1 foot width for the largest ones, and about 6 inches for the smallest ones. After a lot of thinking, these were the final shapes and amount I decided to go for. Now, as you can see, this means I had to make a staggering 14 amount of risers. This meant bricking hell. But first came the task of cutting out all of the shapes I wanted. My material of choice was this pink-purple XPS insulation foam. I bought a bunch of it a while back and I honestly think it doesn't take texture nearly as well as my new yellow-orange XPS foam. The main tool for cutting the shapes was of course the Proxxon Hotwire foam cutter. Now it does have its limitations and I will get back to that later, but the general idea at this point was basically to draw out all of the shapes I had onto the XPS foam and cut it in any way I could. Worth noting is that these sheets are 5 centimeters or circa 2 inches thick, which means that they will be perfect because they will provide full cover for most models, and 2 inches just so happens to be my floor height on most of my buildings. Almost like I planned this, right? So after some cutting, these are the 14 shapes cut out in XPS foam. Bricking hell may commence. Hold your horses, Leif, not quite yet. I mentioned a shortcoming of the Proxxon Hotwire foam cutter. Well, it literally is that it cannot cut anything higher than circa 14 centimeters. For 2 of my risers, this was a problem. See, these 2 shapes I wanted to be able to flip and mirror. 14 risers felt like enough and I didn't want to make 2 more. So in order to make sure that these 2 would have the same height as the rest of the risers, I needed to shave off 5 millimeters of material. But in order to do this cut with a guide on the Proxxon, I first had to dissect these shapes. One clear piece of advice I can give you here is to dissect the large shapes in a bit of a crazy path. The reason why I recommend this is so that you much more easily can fit them back together, sort of like a jigsaw puzzle. Once I had them cut and shaved down, it was a simple thing to just hot glue the pieces back together. Now I said bricking hell, but you know what? It isn't as bad as it seems, and I have learned some things that makes this process a bit easier. I will show you the process of making one of my risers, and I very much use the exact same methods for my other 13 ones. So my number one advice would be to use a low temperature hot glue gun. It really speeds up the process. Practice a bit with how little glue you can use and make sure your hot glue gun leaves the glued area cleanly to avoid any hot glue whisks. Another piece of advice is to vary your brick size. For the sides of my risers, I decided to do the bottom and top 2 rows in 5x5x10mm bricks and use 10x10x5mm stone slabs in the rows of 3 in the middle. Not only does this provide some interesting visual variation, but it speeds up the process as each stone slab covers twice the area of my normal bricks. This will carry over to the top and bottom of this turnable riser. And I will use 20x20x5mm stone slabs in a pattern together with those 10x10x5mm stone slabs. My last advice is to make sure you're keeping yourself entertained in some shape or form. It could be watching YouTube crafting videos such as this, listening to some good old music, or audiobooks. This bricking hell can be quite rewarding and calming. I have a fairly established way I paint my terrain, and I have shown it in a multitude of my Mordheim terrain videos, so I will go through the steps very quickly here. First, I start off with priming the terrain with some Vallejo black primer through the airbrush. Then I use some golden acrylics titanium white through the airbrush to achieve a zenithal highlighting. Then I cover everything with some transparent Liquitex burnt umber ink. I stipple in some dark gray craft paint here and there on anything made of stone. I used a dry brush technique with some light gray craft paint, thinking about where the light hits the object. I glob on some wall filler or spackle on the mortar joints of the walls and dry off any excess with a damp paper cloth. Some ground up coconut fiber gets used as dirt up top and locked in with a fixer made of matte Mod Podge, Flow Aid and water. I attach some of the posters I made here and there using some white glue and water. Some gnarly graffiti is added using some white ink. I spray on some of my homemade wash here and there, and finally some true blood on select locations to get that grimdark feeling. Thank you so much to my patrons for your support. A special shout out goes to my champion and legend level patrons: Agresomnia, Andreas Winberg, Arjen Angenent, Fredrik Kierskad Lund, Gunnar Byström, Henrik Mannestråle, Hunters Cave, Jason Chastain, Mad Nurse, Magnus Solberg, Teddy, Anton Hand, Battle Corgi the 7th, Gun Panda, Niklas Swedenlind, Oliver Granlund, and the Elder Kind. And with that, let's have a look at the final result. Let's start by looking at the risers on the rotating display stand. I really like the end result. It was a massive amount of work with all 14 risers, but now I can say with some certainty that I won't be lacking in verticality on my Mordheim board. But on that note, let's look at the risers on the board. What I love about these risers is how much drama they add. Suddenly you've got elevation, cover, blind corners, places for Skaven to hide, snipers to perch, and warriors to leap from. You can change the layout between every game or during a campaign to reflect a crumbling, shifting city. And because they're stackable, you're not limited by the board's edges anymore. But what do you think about these risers? Were they worth the bricking hell? Am I going insane? Should I have done something differently? Please tell me in the comments down below. My terrain is fairly vertical from the start, so I was wondering if these risers really did have a positive effect on my terrain. So I did a little test. Here is a terrain layout and then the exact same layout, but with risers added. For me, the difference is huge, and I am super happy with the result. Of course, verticality is nothing without access, so in the next video I'll show you how I built modular stairs and ladders that slot right into these risers. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.